Okay, well, maybe the third time's the charm. I've tried twice before yesterday to record a Zoom session for 110 to complete Unit 5, pitch and loudness, but there was no audio. Well, here's hoping we've got audio today. Let's give it a shot. I'm looking at the screen here, and when I look at the bottom of the screen, I can see the microphone little indicator seems to be working, so here's hoping. Okay, share screen. When we look at our notes here last week, we covered fawns. Fawn curves, equal loudness curves. Equal loudness curves would be shown by things like this. Minimal audible field, minimal audible pressure. We know what these things are. No need to go over them today. When you're looking at fawns, it's the same thing, only you're talking about loudness. So look at zero fawns at the bottom here, and look at minimal audible field. Same thing. See how they are absolutely identical. Okay, so basically when you're talking about fawns, however, you're not talking about intensity, you're talking about perceptions of loudness. Simply put, perceptions of loudness. So when you're looking at minimal audible field, that was the softest it took to hear all the different tones with both ears at 1 meter distance from a speaker. And when you're looking at that, bringing it closer, how loud did each of those tones sound? Barely, just barely audible. That's how loud. So they were all equally loud. This one here was equally loud to this one here, was equally loud to this one here, to this one here. But in reality, many more decibels were required to just barely hear. But nonetheless, all the tones were heard equally loud. Okay. MAP is simply the same thing, but with one ear under a headphone. So now we can escape the solid screen here, go to the notes, and we worked our way down and we talked about sones next. And sones were simply looking at, there you go, the loudness of a 1000 hertz tone turned up to 40 dB SPL, however loud that was, memorize it. And now compare how loud you needed to make another tone in order so that that tone would sound equally loud to this one. And then this tone, you turned it up until it sounded equally loud to this one. So every point on this curve is referenced to the loudness of 1000 hertz at 40 dB SPL. We called that 40 fawns, so this whole curve is called 40 fawns because every frequency along it sounded equally loud. And we mark this one as one sone because you can say that something, now you can say you have an anchor for loudness. Now you have a reference. You can use it to say, you can say something is twice as loud as or half as loud as. So something that sounds twice as loud as this would be 2 sones. And something that sounded 3 times as loud would be 3 sones. Enough on that. We did that last week. Moving on down to pitch, we talked about mels. And nobody talks about mels anymore, really, but mels is the unit for pitch. The pitch you think of when you hear a 1000 hertz tone is 1000 mels. And if the sound sounds twice as high in frequency, you'll call it 2000, or twice as high in pitch, you'll call it 2000 mels. But 2000 mels isn't necessarily 2000 hertz. Okay, it really hurts. So when you look at this particular thing, all right, you see 1000 hertz, that would be heard at a pitch of 1000 mels. And what's going to sound like 2000 mels? 2000. If I turn a frequency up, what's going to be 2000 mels? There's 2000 mels. Is that 2000 hertz? I don't think so. See, so it's not a one-to-one relationship there either. It's the same thing when you're looking at intensity. It's not a one-to-one relationship there either, okay? Because if intensity was loudness, you wouldn't have a curve, okay? Intensity is the decibels going up. Loudness is your perception of intensity. And when sounds are very soft, look at the very different decibels required for them to all sound equally loud. So loudness and intensity, not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. Pitch and frequency, not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. Sure, as you increase intensity, things get louder, but it's not a tit-for-tat thing. That's the point. Let's go now, move on to where we started, where we left off. And this is what we need to look at today. Frequency resolution. Remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about differential threshold as opposed to absolute threshold. Absolute threshold is did you hear it or did you not? Differential is you already hear it. What's the smallest change required for you to notice that there's a change? So if you're hearing 1,000 hertz tone, if I make it 1,001 hertz, were you able to hear a difference? Or did I need to make it 1,010 hertz for you to notice a difference? That's called delta F, or just noticeable difference, or difference Lyman for frequency. Now, that is also dealing with frequency resolution. With hair cell damage to the ear, okay, your frequency resolution gets worse. You have a bigger delta F. You need bigger changes in frequency to notice that there's a change in frequency. So now you got to make a 1,000 hertz tone would have to be about 1,020 hertz for you to notice that there's a change. So your keys on your piano are widened. You're not quite as tight. Okay, your resolution, your fine tuning is gone, and that's because your traveling waves have become more rounded. So let's look at that in a picture. First, I'll stop sharing to make sure, yep, the microphone button is still going. Yay, yippee, maybe, just maybe this particular Zoom session will work. All right, here's hoping and praying. Man, to do 2 Zoom sessions yesterday, and both of them didn't work. What a drag. Okay, so you're looking now at inner and outer hair cells. And you're looking at damaged outer hair cells, mostly because damage happens to outer hair cells before inners usually. So what's the upshot of that? Well, here's the outer hair cells stretching and shrinking, pulling this tectorial membrane down so that the hairs of the inner hair cells can get bent. If sounds activating the cochlea are loud, then there's enough fluid motion taking place in here to bend those hairs by themselves. But if sounds are less than 50 dB activating the cochlea, then mechanical help of the outer hair cells is required. Imagine the speed with which this all has to take place. Nonetheless, with damage to outer hair cells, you'll get a mild to moderate hearing loss, but you'll also have traveling waves that are dull and rounded like this. Okay, and we call this a passive traveling wave. I'll move this little bar out of the way. A passive traveling wave. Okay, this is the traveling wave that von Beckersey discovered and won his Nobel Prize for. This traveling wave might have a peak here, or might have a peak here, or here, wherever. This is just an example of one traveling wave caused by a tone. And look at how broad and rounded it is. So it's stimulating many hair cells at once. You haven't got the sharp fine tuning of the outer hair cells, of the action of the outer hair cells does this. So now this person can distinguish between frequencies very close together, whereas this person cannot. So this person has better frequency resolution than this person has. Okay, that's what's meant by increased frequency resolution. And it plays a big part in hearing aids, because what's the biggest complaint of hearing aids? Background noise. So everyone, even though people with normal hearing have more problems hearing in background noise, okay, but people with hearing loss really do. They have more of a problem than normal hearing people do. And hearing aids cannot sharpen a traveling wave. Hearing aids can't do this. They can never bring that back. Okay, it's very important to realize that. Here's another picture of a traveling wave, the blue here, and the envelope of the wave shown in orange, like a kite. As we said before, the steep front always faces the apex or low frequency hair cells. The shallow slope always faces the base. So here would be the foot plate of the stapes, let's say, high frequency hair cells, mid frequencies, and low frequencies. In this case, low frequency stimulation is stimulating these hair cells, and the outer hair cells are serving to amplify and sharpen the peak of the traveling waves so that these inner hair cells, if you follow my cursor, just these inner hair cells are sending info to the brain instead of all of these. Okay, so hearing aids need to, I should say outer hair cells amplify and they sharpen the peak of a traveling wave. So this picture is just showing you an example of an unrolled cochlea, again, just like this, and the person has two traveling waves from two tones, two peaks. With outer hair cell damage, the sharpness of the peaks is gone and the peaks themselves are reduced in size. So now the third one is showing what happens with hearing aids. Yep, you're making the traveling wave larger, but the sharpness isn't there anymore. And that's the point here, okay? Literally, the point, okay? Because hearing aids can't sharpen a traveling wave. They can only make sounds louder. So what must we do for the person with damaged outer hair cells or anybody with hearing loss? What must we do? You've got to somehow help that person be able to separate speech from background noise. I'll stop sharing for a second here. The biggest problem with hearing aids is background noise. So if a person has poorer frequency resolution, he or she cannot separate speech from background noise as well. That's why people with hearing loss have a huge complaint always about background noise in hearing aids. Sure, it's going to bug someone with normal hearing as well, but hearing loss has a worse problem, especially sensory neural hearing loss due to outer and inner hair cell damage. And outers tend to die before inners. When outers die, you'll have a mild to moderate loss. If you have a severe loss, then you've got outer and inner hair cell damage. So the person with outer hair cell damage, typical Mr. Jones, 75 years old, difficulty hearing his grandchildren, likely has outer hair cell damage, poorer frequency resolution, so that even he can hear one-to-one pretty well, but with his hearing aids and background noise, it's going to be his biggest problem. They help. That's why hearing aids are called hearing aids. Okay, but they're not new ears. So what must we do for Mr. Jones? We need to help him separate speech from background noise. And how do we do that? We increase the signal to noise ratio. We deliberately try to make the speech louder than the background noise so that the person with the poorer frequency resolution can, C-A-N, can separate the speech from the noise. So while we can't sharpen the peaks of traveling waves with hearing aids, we can try it another way. Increase the loudness of the speech compared to the background noise so that he can separate them. And that is done by today's digital noise reduction and today's directional microphones that pick up sounds in the direction that the listener is facing. So we have a couple of weapons at our disposal, okay, that can help increase what we call the signal to noise ratio, the signal being the speech and the noise being the crap we don't want to hear. So hearing aids today also can be said to have a twofold task. They need to increase the amplification, duh, okay, but then they also need to increase the signal to noise ratio. So that the twofold role of the outer hair cells, amplifying and sharpening the peak of a traveling wave, the twofold role of hearing aids to amplify as well, but also then to increase the signal to noise ratio because they can't sharpen the peak of a traveling wave. Okay, back to the PowerPoint here. Carrying on. Good stuff. All right. Well, here, let's see if I can advance. There we go. So what happens with hearing loss? The floor is elevated and the ceiling is not. Here's hearing loss going down. Look at this bottom blue line. You could call that bottom blue line minimal audible pressure. Let's look at it here. MAP. Move on up. Move on up. Call it MAP. That bottom blue line that you saw on that particular PowerPoint slide is MAP. So let's go to it. Let's go to it. Over here, over here. There you go. Double click. So now you're looking at MAP, the bottom. So this graph here is showing dBSPL. This one here is showing the audiogram in dBHL. Here's the person's hearing loss, good hearing in the lows, poorer in the highs, and this is showing the same thing only in DBSPL. His floor is elevated, his ceiling is not. And you call that a smaller dynamic range. The floor is elevated, but the ceiling of loudness tolerance is not elevated. This is a normal dynamic range from here to here, and his dynamic range is here to here. And literally, you can almost think about it like my two hands, ceiling, floor. The floor is elevated, but the ceiling didn't change. Dynamic range is the decibel distance between the softest you can hear and the loudest you can tolerate. Good, let's still see if that mic is going. Yep, still is. You can tell I'm paranoid. All right. Okay. Now let's look at the eighth nerve. And the eighth nerve is like a coil, like a rope of many, many, many different fibers, right? Thousands of different fibers. How many fibers do you have in the eighth nerve? 30,000. How many inner hair cells do you have in the cochlea inside of here? 3,000. So each inner hair cell gets 10 eighth nerve fibers, because 10 times 3 is 30,000. And notice that the highs are located on the outside and the low frequency fibers are located on the inside. So the eighth nerve also is tonotopic. And the way we talk about the eighth nerve being tonotopic is when we talk about tuning curves. So here's a set of, oops, boy, this thing's jumping around all over the place. Here's a set of tuning curves. There's 6 of them. Let me move that guy out of the way. And let's just look at the top right one just for fun. Over here. Notice this is frequency on the horizontal axis. This could be 100 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz. You can kind of see it here better. 0.1, they're talking in kilohertz, okay? So 100, 1,000, 10,000. And notice that the shape, this is tuning curves. Now, what does this mean? Well, look at the vertical axis. This is decibels in DBSPL required to get a particular neuron fiber to fire. Okay, so you got 6 of them here. So that must mean that we took 6 of these fibers, 6 of these 30,000 fibers. We just picked 6. Maybe one from here, one from here, one from here, one from here. And then we experimented. And we said, what's the decibels required to get that neuron fiber to fire? And you'll notice that these tuning curves all have a point on the bottom. And that point is called the characteristic frequency. It's the softest, it's at this frequency, follow my cursor, at this frequency, the fewest decibels were required to get that neuron fiber to fire. If I tried to get that neuron fiber to fire with this frequency, I need to make it way more intense. And if I try to get this neuron fiber to fire with a higher frequency, I've got to go to the moon. Okay, so you can see that that particular fiber is tuned to one particular frequency. And the tuning curves are shown then to reveal the fact that the eighth nerve also is tonotopic. Okay, just like the cochlea. And notice here, so look at this one over here. This one here has a point right over 1,000. So it likes 1,000 hertz. 1,000 hertz only needs to be a little more than 0 to get it to fire. This one here likes a higher frequency. Okay, so in other words, a higher frequency is presented, and when it's presented at a soft intensity, it gets that neuron fiber to fire. So you can see that the points are going further and further toward the right, as showing progressively higher and higher and higher frequency eighth nerve fibers, tuning curves. That's all they are, just showing you that the eighth nerve also is tonotopic. This one's boring. This one's boring. Leave it alone. Here's my drawing of a tuning curve as well. So here's normal hearing and someone with a normal cochlea, normal eighth nerve. So we picked on one fiber and we found out at this particular frequency, the fewest decibels were required to get it to fire. So again, the horizontal is frequency, the vertical is the intensity required to make some specific eighth nerve fiber to fire. So the characteristic frequency of this particular tuning curve happens to be toward the high frequencies. But look what happens with sensory neural loss, damage to outer hair cells. We said earlier, damage to outer hair cells does this. It makes a duller and rounded traveling wave peak. Hold that picture in your mind, because guess what? When you've got this, and then you get this, that problem is echoed further up the system into the eighth nerve. So what happens to your tuning curves? They become elevated. More decibels are required to get that neuron fiber to fire, but they also become more rounded, just like the traveling wave did. And now more frequencies at that particular intensity can get that neuron fiber to fire. In other words, the problems that took place in the cochlea are echoed further up the system. That's the point of showing you this, literally the point, okay? So the tuning curves have lost their point. The whole system is not as finely tuned anymore. And you can see that taking place in the cochlea, and that problem is echoed further up in the system. So now let's look at our notes again. Let's follow back to our notes. Let me stop sharing here to be sure that we are still, yep, we're still recording. I still see it. Good. All right. And let's go and share our notes now again and work our way down the page. And when you see this here, place theory. Helmholtz, he's the guy that discovered that the high-frequency hair cells are at the base and low-frequency hair cells are at the apex. And later on, von Bekesi showed about the traveling wave and how the traveling wave excites the high-frequency hair cells or the low-frequency hair cells. So he came later, okay? Traveling waves show how the cochlea is tonotopic. The traveling wave peak stimulates particular hair cells in some particular cochlear region. The envelope, we said, is asymmetrical. The steep front is looking toward the apex. The long tail is sloped toward the base. Outer hair cells amplify the traveling wave for soft inputs below 50. They also sharpen the peak of the traveling wave. Tuning curves show how the eighth nerve is also tonotopic. High frequency fibers on the outside, lows on the inside. Here's your numbers. The eighth nerve has 30,000 fibers, 10 from each of the 3,000 inner hair cells. So 30,000 possible tuning curves, one from each fiber. The tuning curves represent the favorite firing frequency of any one of the eighth nerve fibers. They show the intensity required to get any specific eighth nerve fiber to fire. Note too, they are also asymmetrical, and they become more broadened, just like the traveling wave was more rounded, showing poorer frequency resolution. Now we talk about Rutherford. Rutherford came from another side of the fence. He didn't like the place theory very much, that specific frequencies are represented in specific places, like the keys on a piano, Helmholtz. Rutherford said, no, you know how the brain encodes frequency and you know how how frequencies work in the brain and hearing? He says it's not really so much the location of the hair cells, the highs versus the low frequency hair cells. It's more how many times a second does the eighth nerve fire. So if you hear a 100 hertz tone, that makes the eighth nerve fiber fire 100 times a second. You hear a 2,000 hertz tone, now the eighth nerve is firing 2,000 times a second. Okay, but the problem is eighth nerve fibers or nerve fibers can't fire more than 500 times a second. So how do you hear higher frequency tones? Well, he says, oh, that's where the volley theory comes in. How do you hear 1,000? Well, one fiber is going to fire at 500 hertz and another fiber beside it is going to fire at 2 times a second. 2 times 500 is 1,000. The volley theory. Yeah, seems odd or unlikely. But the temporal theory exists because the place theory cannot explain some things. In science, theories exist to explain things. If one theory can't explain it all, then another one is added in to help explain. And this is where the temporal theory comes in, because there's two things that the place theory cannot describe very well. One of them is the case of the missing fundamental, and the other one's called periodicity pitch. Let's look at the case of the missing fundamental first. So I'm going to move this green bar up out of the way. Let's find the slide that deals with the missing fundamental. That would be, no, I'm looking, here it is. There it is. Okay, I'll blow it up. There we are. So here's four frequencies, 200, 400, 600, 800, and they're all played together. You have this wave. There's your complex wave. But what happens if you take away the fundamental frequency and you just leave these three? Guess what you'll still hear? You'll hear an overall pitch of 200 hertz. And that's because these are separated by 200 hertz. And the place theory really doesn't describe that very well. The temporal theory would describe that a little bit better. The place theory would not describe how, even when you remove the fundamental frequency, you still hear an overall frequency of the distance by which these are separated. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like if you're having a traveling wave here and a traveling wave here and a traveling wave here, how come your overall pitch perception is 200 hertz, even though that one's gone? So it doesn't really, that's one thing. But I find that kind of weird. I don't know. It's there. The other one that I find more interesting yet is periodicity pitch. You ever you're stopped at a parking lot? Let's see. I'll just stop sharing here for a sec. You're at a stoplight, and your window's open, or maybe your window's closed, and someone pulls up beside you on a motorbike. Blah, 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 blah. And you can hear his motorbike or her motorbike revving, you know, the person's rum, rum, da, 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 da. Each da, 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 da of the motor is identical, isn't it? Da, 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 da. And each da is probably some broad band of noise, white noise, pink noise, whatever it is, but each da, da, da is identical. But how come when the person revs, why does your pitch perception go up? Nothing's changed in the little pop, 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 pop of the motor. They've just gone faster. Periodicity pitch. And that's better explained by the temporal theory than it is by the place theory, because each is identical. So each would be making an identical traveling waves. You know, a bunch of traveling waves that would look the same. So how come when you hear more per second, your pitch perception goes up? That's periodicity pitch. So two things kind of, see, that's how science kind of works. When one theory can explain a lot, it can't always explain everything. So other theories come in to kind of help. So it's probably a bit of a combination of both, okay, that help us encode or determine frequency and pitch. All right, but we're still, I think the more friendly one is the place theory, and that's the one that we mostly talk about in our field. Nonetheless, when you're taking a field like psychoacoustics, you can't really, you'd be remiss not to mention the temporal theory. All right, share screen again, and now we can actually wind our way down toward the end of our Zoom session. Look at this, moving along. Let's kind of finish our little session today with a little discussion about three main things with psychoacoustics and sensory neural loss. Some of these we've described, but let's make sure we don't terminate this session today without really highlighting these three things, okay? Number one, loudness, growth, and recruitment. In other words, the dynamic range got smaller, the ceiling was the same, but the floor is elevated. The thresholds increase, the decibels required to just barely hear are increased, but your ceiling of loudness tolerance hasn't changed. So now if we look in our PowerPoint here, and we try to move on down, here we are. Let's look at this picture and talk about it. Okay, here's decibels, 0, 50 to 60, and 100. Call it dBHL. Why not? Hearing level. You can call it dBSPL. The point is basically the point. Watch this. This is your physical intensity, and the vertical is your perceptions of those intensities. How loud was the intensity? So look at the 45-degree angle line. That represents normal hearing. For a normal hearing person, 10 or 20 is heard soft. For a normal hearing person, 50 to 60 sounds comfortable. And for a normal hearing person, 100 sounds too loud. Okay, so you got a dynamic range from 0 to 100. Okay, now look at the steep line here. That represents hearing loss, sensory neural. So now 50 or 60 sounds very soft, and yet 100 sounds too loud. This point here where the two lines meet is called recruitment. Okay, 100 dB sounds just as loud to someone with hearing loss, not conductive, not middle ear pathology, not outer ear pathology, but sensory neural loss, cochlear hair cell damage. 100 dB sounds just as loud to that person as it does to someone with normal hearing. So look at where the lines part. Look at how the words growth, literally like a seed into a sapling into an old tree. The loudness grows more slowly for someone with normal hearing because that person has a dynamic range from 0 to 100. If you've got hearing loss, now 50 or 60 is your floor, and yet 100 is too loud. So loudness grows more rapidly for that person. So if you're looking at in terms of frequency, here you go. This picture you've seen before. I'll move this out of the way. This is really soft. Minimal audible pressure for a normal hearing person. This person's floor has elevated, and it's elevated in the highs. The ceiling of loudness tolerance didn't change. So this picture is showing the very same thing as this picture. This one here just doesn't have frequency on it. This one does. Okay, but they're showing the same thing. And when we look at our notes now, what's most important, read here, the implication for hearing aids is a word called compression. Specifically, wide dynamic range compression. And what does that do? It amplifies soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. If we go to our PowerPoint and look at this slide here, look at the arrows. Compression. It amplifies soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. Because of this problem, because of this situation, because of the reduced dynamic range in hearing loss, that's what hearing aids need to do. They need to amplify soft sounds by a lot so that 0 is lifted up to 50. Now the guy can hear it. But if a 50 decibel sound comes in, I can't lift that up by 50 because now I'm at 100, right? Input plus gain is output. So if my input is really soft, yep, I can amplify by a lot. But if my input is average, I've got to amplify by less. And if my input is loud, I got to leave it alone and don't touch it at all. That's why hearing aids cost so much. They're amplifiers that are constantly changing the amount by which they're amplifying. So if I'm speaking really softly like this, the hearing aid is working hard. And if I start to talk loud, the hearing aid automatically backs off. They're amplifiers that are constantly changing their volume, instantly, depending on the sound coming into the mic. So that, my fine feathered friends, is one of the main problems, okay, psychoacoustic situations with sensory neural loss. The second one, loss of frequency resolution due to outer hair cell damage. We've covered that today. Both the traveling wave and eighth nerve tuning curves become more shallow. We'll look again next week on masking, upward spread of masking, and we'll look at a different kind of tuning curve called a psychophysical tuning curve. And that's going to be showing also how we have poorer frequency resolution. It all deals with the same thing, only this is going to be more not talking about the eighth nerve. We're going to be talking about how easily someone is masked. how easy it is to cover the perception of a sound with another sound. But we'll talk about that more next week. Here, and next week, that's Unit 6. Unit 6, upward spread of masking. All right, but the loss of frequency resolution due to outer hair cell damage, both the traveling wave and eighth nerve tuning curves become more shallow. The person cannot distinguish between frequencies close together and thus cannot separate speech from background noise. This is the major complaint of hearing aids, and what do hearing aids do to overcome this? They try to increase the signal to noise ratio. The third one we've talked about before. If you've got unilateral hearing loss, you have a problem locating the direction of sound. Never think of deafness in one ear as being a 50% hearing loss, okay? It's basically about a 5% hearing loss. 2 ears are about 5 dB better than one. The main problem with having one deaf ear, of course, is directionality, and we've covered that before. It's not so simple that the right ear hears from the right and the left ear hears from the left. Rather, if you're talking to me from this direction, this ear is going to get the sound a split second before this one. Also, the sound to this ear is going to be a split, tiny bit louder. And you've got 2 nuclei in your brainstem, the superior olivary complexes, and they are comparing the time of arrival to the ears and the intensity differences between the ears in order for you to turn your head toward the sound. But we've covered that one before. That takes us anyway to the end of Unit 5. Here's hoping and praying that this third attempt to have a Zoom session on completing Unit 5 was a success. Oh, I hope so. Okay, I will stop recording now. I still see the little green microphone on the bottom of my screen moving up and down as I'm talking, showing that things seem to be recording. So here goes. Here's hoping, and I'll upload this session as soon as possible. Ciao for now. See you next week.